Kant's Principle of Universal Law by Joshua Glasgow. The work of famous philosopher Immanuel Kant is some of the most obscure, difficult-to-read material in all of the moral philosophy literature. So instead of reading the writing of Kant himself, we will be reading his ideas as presented by two contemporary authors. In my opinion, these authors do a great job of faithfully reproducing Kant's ideas in easy-to-understand terms. The first author, Glasgow, explains the first part of Kant's moral theory, the principle of universal law. Kant thinks the only thing that is intrinsically morally valuable is a good will, or the having of good intentions. A person can have a good will even if she is not effective in achieving her moral goals. For example, two Secret Service guards could have equally good moral intentions, but one will actually catch the bullet of an assassin and one won't. This is the opposite of utilitarianism, which focuses on the utility value of a person's actions without regard to her moral intentions. The rest of Kant's moral theory, then, is dedicated to explaining exactly what having a good will amounts to. Now, we need to get a little vocabulary out of the way before we can really dig into Kant's theory. A maxim is an abstract description of the action one intends to perform. It typically takes the ACE form. A, for what action you plan to do. C, in what circumstances. And E, for what end, goal, or purpose. You can fill in the following pattern in order to formulate a maxim. I will do act A in circumstances C for end E. Example, I will brush my teeth every morning to avoid cavities. Notice that a maxim is not a principle about what you should do, rather it is a principle that describes the action you actually intend. For example, you could have the following maxim: I will rob a bank at gunpoint when I'm broke in order to pay my bills, although this is not something you should do. Imperatives, on the other hand, do describe what a person should do instead of what she actually intends to do. There are two kinds of imperatives: hypothetical imperatives and categorical imperatives. A hypothetical imperative takes an if-then form and expresses an ought claim that applies to you by virtue of your subjective or personal ends. For instance, if you want to get an A on the exam, then you should study for it. This imperative applies to you if and only if you do in fact want to get an A on the exam. If you don't want to get an A, then this imperative makes no rational demand of you. That is, if you don't study, you are not being irrational. A categorical imperative is different. It expresses an ought claim that applies to you independently of your subjective personal ends. That is, categorical imperatives do make rational demands of a person, regardless of her ends, purposes, desires, etc. Moral principles, according to Kant, take the form of categorical imperatives. They apply to everyone, regardless of individual differences. Kant thinks that there is one supreme principle of morality which can be described with a categorical imperative. He formulates this all-important categorical imperative in terms of a universal law. Act only in accordance with that maxim through which you can at the same time will that it become a universal law. Or, Act as if the maxim of your action were to become by your will a universal law of nature. And these are supposed to be equivalent. We can more easily use the formula of the law of nature as a test to figure out our moral duties according to Kant's theory. These are the steps. First, you must figure out your maxim in the ACE format. Second, you must universalize your maxim, to think of a world where everyone does what you are doing. Finally, you then see if this universalization is successful. If the maxim can be successfully universalized, acting on it is morally permissible. And if not, then acting on it is morally impermissible. There are two different ways in which a maxim can fail the universalization test. First, there can be a contradiction in conception, meaning that it is not even possible to imagine a world wherein everyone follows the maxim. Read about this on page 134. Second, there can be a contradiction in the will. This means that the world wherein everyone follows the maxim is imaginable, but the maxim contradicts something else that the agent must will. Read about this on pages 134 and 135. On page 135, there is a chart displaying all four possible outcomes of the formula of the law of nature test and an example of a case that falls into each category. Please do take the time to read the preceding section. It is well written and explains exactly how to apply the formula of the law of nature test in each case. If you have any questions about this section, please post them on the discussion board and I will be happy to answer them. Glasgow helpfully identifies two problems with the formula of the law of nature in this article. First, there is a problem with false negatives. Second, there is a problem with maxim formulation. Consider the maxim that I will buy model trains and not sell them. To see whether this action is morally permissible, we can run the formula of the law of nature test. However, the maxim fails the test. This is because a world in which everyone only collects trains without anyone selling them is logically impossible and therefore a contradiction in terms. But it's ridiculous to think that buying model trains without selling them is indeed morally impermissible. So there must be a problem with the formula of the law of nature test because it returns false negative results. An even more serious problem with Kant's theory is that of maxim formulation. The idea here is that depending on how one formulates her maxim, the very same action can come out being both permissible and impermissible according to the formula of the law of nature test. Look at maxims A, B, and C on page 136. They all describe the same action of robbing a bank, but B and C pass the test while A fails. To take this problem a step further, we might notice that all possible actions can be described using many different maxims. So it is no longer clear that the formula of the law of nature test, lacking determinate results, has any value at all as a moral decision procedure. In his conclusion on pages 137 through 139, Glasgow briefly offers some provisional solutions to the problems previously discussed. Nevertheless, they are big problems that any neo-Kantian will need to thoroughly address in order to make Kantian ethics tenable. However, Kantianism is attractive to many because it captures the moral intuitions that moral rules apply to everyone unconditionally, and that a person shouldn't make a moral exception of herself when deciding what to do.